People always talk about peace and quiet as if it's a luxury. For me, Jake Alderman, a fourth-generation farmer, it was just another Tuesday afternoon, standing knee-deep in mud, rebuilding fences and minding my own business. I'd lived in the rolling fields of Willow Creek my whole life, and honestly, the worst disruption I'd faced was when my neighbor's goat chewed through my Wi-Fi cables. Life was simple, predictable, boring even, until she moved in. Brenda Pennington arrived in Willow Creek like a Category 5 hurricane wrapped in designer yoga pants, a clipboard always in hand. With bleached blonde hair teased into a helmet and an attitude sharper than her perfectly manicured fingernails, Brenda quickly ascended the ranks of our sleepy HOA, becoming president within 3 weeks. Her first act, declaring war on garden. Gnomes, apparently, their inappropriate postures, offended her moral sensibilities. I laughed it off at first, but Brenda Pennington wasn't someone who took laughter lightly. Things changed when I got her first official letter, delivered in a pristine envelope embossed with the words, "Courtesy Notice." Apparently, my new wooden gate, which I'd built from my own trees, was exactly 2.5 inches too tall. Brenda had measured personally, standing there with a tape measure and a smug grin. Her note warned of fines, court actions, and something called disciplinary hearings, all over a couple inches of cedar. I decided ignoring Brenda was probably best. After all, my family's farm predated Willow Creek's cookie-cutter subdivision by about a century. Brenda's clipboard authority ended at the edge of my property, or so I believed. Then came the second notice, taped passive-aggressively to my front door, written in fluorescent pink ink. "Your failure to comply threatens community harmony." That's when I realized Brenda wasn't just obsessive, she was unhinged. Soon, flyers mysteriously appeared in neighbors' mailboxes, describing me as an antisocial agitator who flouted rules everyone else had to follow. Brenda's absurd demands multiplied: grass too tall, tractor noise too loud, even accusing my cattle of staring at residents menacingly, each complaint more ridiculous and theatrical than the last. Yet people listened. Meetings became kangaroo courts, where Brenda brandished her clipboard like a royal scepter, shouting down objections. Her power grew unchecked, buoyed by frightened silence from the neighborhood. Still, I refused to play her game, until the morning I awoke to survey stakes hammered into my land. "What the hell is this?" I roared, confronting Brenda in front of an audience she'd conveniently assembled, neighbors with popcorn expressions ready for a show. "Oh, Jake," she smiled thinly, enjoying the drama she'd orchestrated. "This land belongs to Willow Creek now. We bought it from you. Didn't you see the paperwork?" Blood rushed to my face, disbelief and fury mingling. "I didn't sell anything, Brenda." She calmly unfolded documents from her clipboard, brandishing my own signature, or something that looked dangerously close, on contracts transferring over 1,200 hobless acres of farmland to the HOA. "You're mistaken. Everything's official." She leaned in, whispering theatrically for the crowd. "It's best to cooperate. Legal fees are costly." She turned away triumphantly as murmurs rippled through the crowd. I felt trapped in a nightmare. Was my family, legacy, generations of sweat and sacrifice, about to crumble beneath Brenda Pennington's designer boots and fraudulent paperwork? Then, just as panic threatened to swallow me whole, my grandfather's voice echoed through my memory. "Know your rights, son, and always, always keep the water." I inhaled sharply, heart pounding as a bold, reckless idea began forming in my mind. Brenda Pennington had started this war, but she had no idea I'd just discovered how to finish it. That night I pored over old boxes of family documents stacked haphazardly in the attic, sifting through faded yellowed papers illuminated by a single dangling bulb. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded a fragile parchment stamped Willow Creek Water Rights, 1897. Reading carefully, my pulse quickened with each line, the words practically glowing with hope. The language was clear. My family held exclusive control over the valley's irrigation channels, wells, and the entire watershed that nourished the neatly trimmed lawns and carefully pruned gardens Brenda cherished so obsessively. "Checkmate," I whispered to myself, almost laughing. Brenda had been so fixated on power plays and petty rules, she'd completely overlooked the very foundation of the community itself: water. But I had learned the hard way that Brenda was always several absurd steps ahead. Early the next morning, I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, only to nearly trip over a notice nailed dramatically to my front steps, flapping in the wind like a medieval decree. Notice of intent to demolish unapproved structures. Attached was a Polaroid of my barn, my grandfather's barn, marked up with big red X's and words like unsafe and illegal in Brenda's signature hot pink marker. I stormed straight over to the HOA office, formerly Mrs. Jenkins' cozy sewing shop, now a sterile fortress of rules. Brenda sat smugly at her glass-topped desk, sipping kale juice through a straw, surrounded by motivational posters about teamwork. "Brenda, you've crossed the line," I snarled, slamming her notice onto the pristine glass. "You have zero authority over my land, my barn, or anything else on Alderman property." She raised one carefully plucked eyebrow, utterly unbothered. "Jake, denial is not becoming. It's simply the rules which apply to everyone equally." She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Honestly, Jake, if you'd played ball from the beginning, maybe it wouldn't have come to this." I leaned forward too, our faces inches apart. "I didn't start this fight, but believe me, Brenda, I'll finish it." She smiled, eyes glittering dangerously. "Try me." Over the next few days, Brenda intensified her campaign. Flyers appeared overnight, claiming my barn was an imminent safety hazard. Contractors arrived unannounced to measure and photograph my property. The community meetings turned into public humiliations, Brenda orchestrating residents like puppets, convincing them my refusal to comply threatened everyone's property values. My friends, once supportive, now avoided eye contact in the grocery store, unwilling to challenge Brenda's reign. The turning point came on an oppressively hot afternoon. Brenda, clipboard in hand, watched with cold satisfaction as bulldozers idled menacingly at the edge of my fields, engines rumbling like beasts awaiting orders. "You're bluffing!" I shouted above the noise, standing defiantly in the bulldozer's path. "You know you can't legally demolish a single thing here." Brenda's eyes sparkled maliciously. "Jake, the paperwork says otherwise, and paperwork always wins." She gestured theatrically to the machines behind her. "Last chance, join us or watch your heritage crumble." A crowd gathered, neighbors, farmers, former friends, all staring, waiting for my move. I realized, in Brenda's world, truth didn't matter. Only perception. Heart hammering, I shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "Fine, but understand, Brenda, actions have consequences, and you're about to learn that lesson the hard way." I turned, leaving her smiling arrogantly, convinced. She'd won, but she'd never imagined what was coming next. That night, I quietly redirected the irrigation channels away from the neatly manicured lawns and sparkling pools of Willow Creek. When morning came, sprinklers sputtered dry, fountains stood empty, and a chorus of panicked calls flooded Brenda's voicemail. I watched from afar, smiling softly as her calm empire began to unravel. Just as satisfaction crept in, my phone vibrated, a text appearing ominously. "You've gone too far, Jake. Now you've declared war." Brenda, furious yet eerily composed, had discovered my move faster than expected and was already planning her counterattack. But as I stood, boots sinking into freshly watered soil, I smiled grimly. Brenda still believed she was untouchable, blind to the reality that I'd just baited her perfectly. She didn't realize it yet, but she'd stepped right into my carefully laid trap, and soon enough, everyone, including Brenda, would see exactly who held the real power in Willow Creek. The next morning, Willow Creek descended into chaos. Without water, Brenda's idyllic suburbia quickly turned into a dry wasteland. Brown lawns replaced manicured greenery, and angry residents marched toward the HOA office, their sunburned faces twisted in outrage. Brenda, ever the consummate politician, stood at the entrance, soothing the mob with promises she couldn't possibly keep. From the porch of my farmhouse, I watched her struggle, sipping coffee and savoring each angry gesture thrown her way. But my satisfaction was short-lived. Brenda wouldn't go quietly, and sure enough, an hour later, her pearl-white Mercedes skidded into my driveway, kicking up dust in dramatic fashion. "You think this little stunt scares me, Jake?" she snapped, slamming the car door and stalking toward me with the intensity of a drill sergeant. "You've violated community guidelines, public safety, and now you're guilty of environmental sabotage." I raised an eyebrow, amused. "Environmental sabotage? That's a new one, Brenda. Seems you've been reading more of your rule books." Her eyes narrowed dangerously, nostrils flaring. "Laugh all you want. The sheriff's on my side. He'll arrest you for tampering with public resources." I shook my head calmly, holding up the old parchment, the water rights agreement. "Public resources? Brenda, you really should have done your homework. I own every drop of water your community depends on. The only sabotage here is your fraud and lies." She blinked, momentarily off balance before regaining composure. Her voice grew colder, almost venomous. "No judge in the county would side with a reckless farmer over an entire community." "Wanna bet?" I smiled softly, holding up a folder of documents I'd painstakingly assembled. "I uncovered your little scheme, Brenda. The forged signatures, the fake land sale, everything. Your empire was built on a pile of fraudulent paperwork." Her confidence faltered for the first time, but she quickly masked it with a brittle laugh. "You have nothing, Jake, just accusations." "We'll see," I said evenly, meeting her gaze. "See you in court." The courtroom felt like a coliseum, packed with neighbors, reporters, and townsfolk, drawn by whispers of scandal. Brenda strutted in confidently, impeccably dressed, her clipboard exchanged for thick files of intimidating documents, but her smugness faded rapidly as evidence piled up against her. Each falsified signature, each doctored sale contract was presented meticulously, unraveling her power stitch by stitch. "You betrayed this community, Brenda," I declared, pointing directly at her. "Not me." Brenda squirmed in her seat, her facade finally cracking. "Everything I did was for Willow Creek's good," she shouted hysterically, losing her calm demeanor entirely. Her voice echoed embarrassingly loud in the hushed courtroom. "None of you understand how much I sacrificed." The judge silenced her with a sharp glare. "Mrs. Pennington, you will restrain yourself." In a desperate theatrical flourish, Brenda rose dramatically. "This is a witch hunt. You're all jealous. I'm the victim here." Someone snickered audibly. Brenda, panicked, spun around, searching for allies, but no one met her pleading gaze. Faces she'd once cowed into submission now watched with a mixture. of pity and disgust. The judge spoke, finality in his voice. "Mrs. Pennington, your actions demonstrate a shocking disregard for the law. I hereby revoke your position as HOA president and order immediate restitution of Mr. Alderman's property." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Brenda stood, dazed, clipboard slipping from her fingers with a hollow echo on the polished floor. She'd lost everything, her power, her reputation, even the clipboard she wielded like a sword. Outside, neighbors surrounded me, offering sheepish apologies and grateful handshakes. But the sweetest moment was Brenda's solitary walk of shame through the parking lot. Mascara-stained face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, no longer the feared dictator, just a defeated woman forced to face the humiliation she had crafted for herself. Months passed, and Willow Creek healed. Water flowed freely again, nourishing both lawns and friendships. I converted part of my farmland into a community garden, teaching residents how to grow tomatoes rather than resentment. Brenda's authoritarian reign quickly became an embarrassing footnote, replaced by cooperation and laughter. Ironically, Brenda herself moved to an HOA-free community in the desert, likely dreaming of ways to impose rules on cacti. Occasionally, someone would joke that her perfectly manicured hedges still haunted their nightmares, and laughter would ripple across our peaceful gatherings. One sunny afternoon, as I fixed the infamous gate that started it all, a new notice appeared. Curious, I opened it cautiously, then chuckled deeply. "Courtesy notice, community BBQ next weekend. Absolutely no clipboards allowed." I smiled, folding it into my pocket. Brenda Pennington had tried to control Willow Creek with fear and paperwork, but in the end, she'd achieved the exact opposite, reminding us all that community thrives not through absurd rules, but through trust, humor, and the occasional rebellious farmer willing to stand his ground.